In the chalk hills of southern England, a ring of impossible stones stands against the sky. Some weigh more than 40 tons. Some were dragged from quarries 240 kilometers away, across mountains and rivers and bogs. They were raised more than 5,000 years ago, before Egypt finished its first pyramid, before writing reached most of Europe, before the wheel was used in Britain for any practical purpose. And nobody knows exactly how it was done. Nobody knows exactly why. We know who lived on these islands then. We have their bones, their tools, their houses, their carvings, their dead. What we do not have is their voice. They left no written language. They left only the things they made. And the things they made are stranger and more sophisticated than the Romans who would arrive thousands of years later were ever willing to admit. This is the story of a forgotten civilization, the people who shaped Britain before Rome ever set foot on its shores. Before the Romans, there was a civilization in Britain that built things we still can't explain. And tonight, for the next 2 hours, we are going to look at what they left behind. Before we go any further, take a moment to subscribe to this channel and hit the notification bell so you do not miss the next deep dive into the mysteries of the ancient world. If you find what you hear tonight worth thinking about, share this video with someone else who appreciates real history that the textbooks rarely tell properly. Every subscription and every share helps this channel keep producing long-form documentaries on the strangest and most overlooked corners of the human past. Now, with that done, let us begin. To understand what the pre-Roman builders of Britain accomplished, we first have to understand what kind of world they lived in. When the last great ice sheets retreated from northern Europe around 12,000 years ago, Britain was not yet an island. It was a peninsula attached to the European continent by a vast lowland plain that archaeologists now call Doggerland. Hunters walked across this plain, following herds of red deer and aurochs. They fished the rivers that wound through it. They built temporary camps and left behind the small flint tools that still wash up on the beaches of East Anglia and the Netherlands today. Then, slowly at first, and then with increasing speed, the seas rose. Glacial meltwater filled the North Sea basin. Doggerland began to drown. By around 6,500 BC, the connection was severed, and what had once been a continental peninsula became an archipelago, a cluster of islands, set apart from the European mainland by the cold grey water of what we now call the English Channel and the North Sea. The people who were left on these islands after the flooding did not simply revert to isolated savagery, as later Roman propagandists would suggest. They continued to develop, to innovate, to build. Around 4000 BC, new ideas and probably new people began arriving from the European continent, bringing farming, pottery, domesticated animals, and a profound change in how human beings organized themselves on the landscape. This Neolithic transition, as archaeologists call it, transformed Britain. Forests were cleared, fields were planted. Cattle and sheep replaced wild deer as the main source of meat. Villages took shape. And, almost from the beginning, monuments began to rise. These were not the monuments of a primitive people. The structures the early British Neolithic communities built were vast, precise, ambitious, and deeply considered. They required coordinated labor by hundreds or thousands of people. They required engineering knowledge that took generations to develop. They required astronomical observation, geometric calculation, and a level of social organization that flatly contradicts the image of pre-Roman Britain as a wilderness of painted barbarians. The Romans, when they finally arrived in 43 AD, found a Britain that had been shaped for 4,000 years by sophisticated human hands. The Romans then proceeded to dismiss those hands, to talk about the British as wild and tattooed and primitive, because to acknowledge the truth would have undermined their own civilizing mission. The story you are about to hear is a story that Rome did its best to bury. We begin where any honest account of pre-Roman Britain must begin, with the Great Stone Circle on Salisbury Plain. Stonehenge is so familiar from photographs and television documentaries that it has almost lost its capacity to astonish. We have seen it too many times. We think we know it. We do not. The reality of Stonehenge, when you stop and consider what it actually represents, is far stranger than the postcard image suggests. The monument we see today was built in multiple phases across roughly 1,500 years. The earliest phase, around 3000 BC, consisted of a circular ditch and bank with a ring of 56 pits inside it, now called the Aubrey Holes, after the 17th century antiquarian John Aubrey, who first identified them. These pits held cremated human remains. Stonehenge began, in other words, as a cemetery, a vast, circular burial ground for an elite group of people whose ashes were carefully placed in pits, arranged in a precise ring. The site was already sacred, already ceremonial, already engineered to mathematical specifications, long before the first stone was raised. The stones came later, in two great phases. The first stones to arrive, around 2500 BC, were the blue stones. There are roughly 80 of them in total, each weighing between 2 and 5 tons, made of a distinctive spotted dolerite and other igneous rocks, and they did not come from anywhere near Salisbury Plain. They came from the Preseli Hills in southwest Wales, a journey of around 240 kilometres by the most direct overland route. For a long time, the dominant theory was that glaciers had carried these stones from Wales to Salisbury during the last ice age, and that the Neolithic builders had simply found them already on the chalk and incorporated them into their monument. That theory has now been largely abandoned. Geological and archaeological work led by Mike Parker Pearson and Richard Bevins and Robert Ixer has identified the exact quarries in the Preseli Hills from which the blue stones were extracted. Two of them, Carn Goedog and Craig Roswy Felin, have been excavated in detail. Stone working tools, wedges and ramps have been found in situ. There is no longer any serious doubt. The blue stones were quarried in Wales by human beings and transported, somehow, to Salisbury Plain. How they were transported remains one of the great open questions of British archaeology. Some researchers have proposed a sea route, with the stones lashed to rafts and floated along the south coast of Wales, around the southwestern peninsula, and up the rivers of southern England. Others have argued for a primarily overland route, with the stones dragged on wooden sledges over greased timber rails by teams of hundreds of people. Experimental archaeology has shown that both methods are physically possible, but neither has been definitively proven. What we know is that it happened. Stones weighing several tons each were moved hundreds of kilometers across a landscape without roads, without wheels, without metal tools, by a society that we still tend to underestimate. The bluestones did not arrive by accident. They were chosen deliberately, sourced from a specific place, transported with enormous effort, and erected with mathematical care on a site that had already been sacred for centuries. The second phase of stones at Stonehenge is even more extraordinary. The Great Sarsens, the massive grey blocks that form the iconic outer ring and the inner trilithon horseshoe, were raised around 2500 BC. The largest of them weighs around 40 tons. Until recently, their source was uncertain. They were assumed to have come from the Marlborough Downs, around 30 kilometres north of Salisbury Plain, where similar sandstone occurs naturally. In 2020, a research team led by David Nash used geochemical analysis on a core sample taken from one of the Sarsens in the 1950s and confirmed that at least 50 of the 52 surviving Sarsens did indeed come from a specific location in the Marlborough Downs called West Woods. The stones were quarried there, dressed to shape, and then transported across 30 kilometres of rolling chalk country, including the deep valley of the River Avon. Each stone required, at minimum, several hundred people to move. The construction of Stonehenge, in its Sarsen phase, was a multi-generational project that mobilised labour from across a vast region of southern Britain. And once the stones arrived on site, they were worked with a precision that has no real parallel in any other megalithic monument anywhere in Europe. The Sarsens were not simply set up in a rough circle. They were carefully shaped, smoothed, and tapered. The lintels that sit on top of the upright stones are curved on their inner and outer faces to follow the line of the circle. They are joined to the uprights by mortise and tenon joints, a woodworking technique adapted to stone with extraordinary skill. Each lintel is also joined to its neighbours by tongue and groove joints. The whole upper ring of Sarsen lintels was once a continuous curved band of stone, locked together by carpentry techniques applied to 40-ton blocks. This is not the work of casual labourers. This is the work of specialists, of master craftsmen, who had spent their entire lives learning how to do exactly this in a society sophisticated enough to support such specialization. The astronomical alignments of Stonehenge are perhaps the most famous of its features, but they are also commonly misunderstood. The monument is aligned to the summer solstice sunrise and the winter solstice sunset along a single axis that runs through the heel stone outside the circle, through the entrance, and through the great trilithon at the center. On the longest day of the year, the sun rises directly above the heel stone as seen from the center of the monument. On the shortest day, the sun sets in the opposite direction, into the gap of the great trilithon. This much is undisputed. What is less often emphasized is that the winter solstice alignment may have been the primary one. The largest gathering of people at Stonehenge, on the evidence of animal bones found at the nearby settlement of Durrington Walls, appears to have taken place in midwinter, when pigs slaughtered in autumn were roasted and consumed in vast quantities. Stonehenge may have been, above all, a winter monument, a place to mark the death of the year and the promise of returning light. The summer solstice tourism that fills the site today is, in this reading, a partial inversion of what the original builders had in mind. The deepest mystery of Stonehenge, however, is not how it was built, or even precisely when it was built. The deepest mystery is why. What was it for? What did the people who built it believe was happening when they gathered there? The honest answer is that we do not know. We can guess. We can theorize. We can compile lists of features and probable functions. We can talk about ancestor worship, about solar religion, about funerary processions, about healing pilgrimage, about political assembly, about astronomical calculation. All of these theories have some evidence behind them. None of them has anything close to conclusive proof. The people who built Stonehenge left no writings, no creation myths, no liturgies, no doctrinal texts. They left only the monument itself, and the monument refuses to fully explain itself. After more than 3 centuries of serious antiquarian and archaeological investigation, after geophysical surveys and isotope analyses and Bayesian radiocarbon modeling, the central question of Stonehenge remains essentially unanswered. We do not know why they built it. What we do know is that Stonehenge was part of a much larger ceremonial landscape, one of the most intensively monumentalized regions anywhere in prehistoric Europe. Within a radius of a few kilometers around Stonehenge, there are hundreds of barrows, dozens of smaller monuments, vast earthworks, processional avenues, and the great timber circle and settlement of Durrington Walls. The Stonehenge of the tourist photograph is just the visible centerpiece of a sacred landscape that stretched for many miles across Salisbury Plain. And Salisbury Plain itself was just one of several major ceremonial regions in Neolithic and early Bronze Age Britain. We move now to the next of them, which lies about 30 kilometers to the north, in the chalk country of Wiltshire. Avebury is the largest stone circle in the world. It is so large, in fact, that an entire village sits inside it. The outer ring encloses an area of around 11.5 hectares, surrounded by a massive ditch and external bank that originally stood many meters high. The ditch alone, when first excavated, was over 9 meters deep, cut through solid chalk with antler picks and shoulder blade shovels by a society without metal tools. The volume of chalk removed from that single ditch has been estimated at around 200,000 cubic meters. To dig it required something on the order of 1.5 million worker hours. And the ditch is only one element of the monument. Inside the great outer circle stand 2 smaller stone circles, each of which would itself be considered a major prehistoric monument if it stood alone. Within these inner circles stood arrangements of even more massive sarsens, some of which may have weighed in excess of 100 tons. Avebury was constructed in the late Neolithic, around 2600 BC, during the same general period as the main phases of Stonehenge. But Avebury and Stonehenge are very different monuments, and the difference is instructive. Stonehenge is finished, polished, geometric, almost architectural in the modern sense. Its stones are dressed and shaped, its lintels are jointed, its plan is precisely circular. Avebury, by contrast, is rough, sprawling, organic. Its stones are unworked, set up in their natural shapes, chosen for their forms but not modified. Its plan is approximately circular, but not mathematically so. Avebury feels older than Stonehenge in some intangible way, more rooted in the chalk, less like a piece of architecture, and more like a slow gathering of stones that grew out of the land itself. Some archaeologists have argued that Avebury represents an earlier tradition of monument building, a more primal megalithic religion, while Stonehenge represents a later, more elite, more centralized expression of the same broad set of beliefs. Others see them as essentially contemporary but functionally distinct, perhaps serving different communities or different ceremonial purposes. From Avebury, two great avenues of standing stones once led out across the landscape, the West Kennet Avenue running south toward another monument called the Sanctuary, and the now largely vanished Beckhampton Avenue running west. The West Kennet Avenue alone was over 2.5 kilometers long, lined with around 100 pairs of standing stones, the stones on each side carefully matched in shape and size. Walking along this avenue must have been a ceremonial experience of extraordinary intensity, a physical processional route between two sacred places. The whole landscape was organized around movement, around procession, around the slow, ritualized passage of people through a constructed sacred geography. We are very far here from the image of pre-Roman Britons as scattered tribal hunters. We are looking at a society capable of conceiving and executing infrastructure projects on a scale that would not be matched in Britain again until the Romans built their roads 2,500 years later. Less than 2 kilometers south of Avebury, looming over the modern road that runs between Marlborough and Devizes, stands the largest artificial mound in prehistoric Europe. It is called Silbury Hill. It is around 40 meters high, with a base diameter of around 160 meters, and it contains around 340,000 cubic meters of chalk, soil, and clay. It was built in stages between roughly 2,400 and 2,300 BC, over a period of perhaps a century or so, and it has no obvious purpose at all. It is not a burial mound. Numerous tunnels and shafts have been driven into it over the centuries by treasure hunters, antiquarians, and modern archaeologists, including a major investigation in the 1960s led by Richard Atkinson and televised on the BBC. No central burial has ever been found. No chamber, no grave goods, no bones. Silbury Hill is, as far as we can tell, a solid mound of carefully constructed chalk and earth, raised by human labor over generations, for no funerary purpose whatsoever. Theories abound, of course. Some have suggested it was a platform for ceremonies that took place on its summit. Others have proposed an astronomical function, with the mound serving as a sighting point for observations of the sun or moon against the surrounding skyline. Others have argued that the act of construction itself was the point, that the mound was a kind of accumulated offering of labor, with each generation adding its own layer as a religious or political act. Still others have pointed to the seasonal flooding of the surrounding low ground in winter, when Silbury Hill briefly stands as an island in a temporary lake, and have suggested that this watery aspect was central to its meaning. None of these theories can be confirmed. The hill itself stands silent, the largest pre-Roman artificial structure in northern Europe, a monument to a society that mobilized enormous resources for purposes we no longer understand. Within the same Avebury ceremonial landscape, just a short distance to the south of Silbury Hill, lies another extraordinary monument. West Kennet Longbarrow is one of the largest and best preserved of the British Neolithic chambered tombs. It was built around 3,650 BC, more than 1,000 years before Stonehenge, more than 1,000 years before Silbury Hill. It is a long mound of earth and chalk, around 100 meters in length, with a stone chamber at its eastern end. The chamber is divided into 5 compartments and contains a passage with a paved floor and massive sarsen uprights, supporting capstones that have stood in place for nearly 6,000 years. Inside these compartments, when the tomb was excavated in the 1950s by Stuart Pigott, the disarticulated bones of dozens of individuals were found, men, women, and children, their skeletons mixed together, certain bones missing or rearranged, the whole interior carefully managed by the people who used it. The use pattern of West Kennet Longbarrow is itself a mystery. The dead were not simply buried and left. They were brought to the tomb, deposited, and then over time their bones were sorted, moved, sometimes removed entirely. Skulls and long bones in particular were frequently taken out, presumably to be used elsewhere in ceremonies, or kept in households, or passed down through families. The tomb was a place of ongoing relationship with the ancestors. not a final resting place. It was used for around 1,000 years before being deliberately sealed with large blocking stones around 2400 BC, at the same general period when Silbury Hill was being built nearby. The sealing of the Long Barrow and the raising of the Great Mound may have been connected, the closure of one chapter of religious life and the opening of another, the end of the ancestor-centered chambered tomb tradition, and the beginning of something else. We move now from Wiltshire to the far north of Britain, to a group of islands that has produced some of the most remarkable Neolithic archaeology in all of Europe. The Orkney Islands lie off the northern tip of Scotland, a low green archipelago in the cold grey waters of the North Atlantic. They feel, today, like a remote periphery, the edge of the inhabited world. But in the Neolithic, between roughly 3,500 and 2,500 BC, Orkney was something close to the opposite. It was a centre. It was a place where new religious ideas and new architectural forms were being developed, exported southward to the rest of Britain, and elaborated to a level of sophistication that the rest of the islands would not match for centuries. The Neolithic of Orkney is so distinctive, so concentrated, and so important that UNESCO has designated 4 of its key sites collectively as the heart of Neolithic Orkney World Heritage Site. We will look at all 4, beginning with the most domestic of them, the buried village of Skara Brae. Skara Brae was rediscovered in the winter of 1850, when a violent storm stripped away the grass and sand from a low mound on the Bay of Scale on the west coast of Orkney's mainland. Beneath the vegetation, the storm exposed the tops of ancient stone walls. Local landowner William Watt began excavating, and over the following decades, a remarkable cluster of structures emerged. There are around 10 interconnected stone houses, all of them built into a midden of accumulated waste that insulated them against the Orkney weather. The houses are linked by covered stone passages. Each house contains stone furniture, beds, dressers, hearths, and storage boxes set into the floor, all built of the same flagstone that forms the local geology. The village was occupied between roughly 3,180 and 2,500 BC. It is older than the pyramids of Giza. It is older than Stonehenge in its Sarsen phase. It is one of the best preserved Neolithic settlements anywhere in the world. What makes Skara Brae so striking is not just its preservation, but its sophistication. The houses are not crude shelters. They are carefully designed dwellings with thought given to comfort, to circulation, to storage, to social interaction. The stone dresser opposite the entrance of each house, with its shelves arranged for display, appears to have been a place for showing valued objects to visitors. The beds, set against the side walls, were filled with bracken or heather and probably draped with skins. The central hearth provided warmth and light. Drains beneath the floor in at least one house suggest that some form of indoor sanitation existed, possibly the world's oldest known indoor lavatory. The whole settlement was sheltered, organized, and apparently quite comfortable, providing a standard of domestic life that would not be widely matched in Scotland for thousands of years afterward. The objects found at Skara Brae deepen the mystery rather than resolving it. Carved stone balls have been recovered from the site, beautifully worked spherical objects with raised knobs or projections in various geometric arrangements. Hundreds of these carved stone balls have been found across Scotland, dating mostly to the late Neolithic. Their purpose has never been satisfactorily explained. They are not weapons. They are not tools in any obvious sense. They are too elaborate and too carefully made to be casual playthings. Some are decorated with spiral and lozenge patterns that link them to a wider symbolic vocabulary found across Atlantic Europe in the same period. They were valued objects, made with great skill, used somehow in social or ritual life, and the meaning that gave them that value has been entirely lost. Skara Brae was abandoned around 2500 BC. Why is not clear. Sand began to bury it, and the inhabitants seem to have left in an orderly fashion, taking some belongings with them, but leaving others behind. The climate may have been deteriorating. Soil exhaustion may have made the surrounding fields less productive. Whatever the reason, the houses were sealed up by accumulating sand and remained hidden for nearly 4,500 years until the storm of 1850 revealed them again. They are now one of the most visited archaeological sites in Scotland, and walking among them today looking down into rooms whose stone furniture still stands as it stood when Neolithic Orcadians sat by their fires, is one of the more disorienting experiences in British archaeology. The distance between us and them collapses. We are looking at homes, a short distance away, on a ridge overlooking two lochs, stands one of the most architecturally sophisticated structures of European prehistory. Maes Howe is a chambered cairn built around 2800 BC of a complexity and precision that has astonished every archaeologist who has studied it. From outside, it appears as a low grass-covered mound, around 7 meters high and roughly 35 meters in diameter. The entrance is a long, low passage built of massive dressed sandstone slabs, some of them weighing several tons, jointed together with such precision that a knife blade cannot be inserted between them. The passage runs for around 9 meters into the heart of the mound and opens into a central chamber, roughly 4.5 meters square and 4.5 meters high. 3 smaller side chambers open off the main chamber, each entered through a low aperture in the wall. The whole structure is built of carefully selected and shaped stone, with corbelled walls rising in concentric rings toward the roof, the upper portions sealed by capstones that have held in place for nearly 5,000 years. The construction quality of Maes Howe surpasses anything else from the period in Britain. The corner buttresses of the central chamber are formed from single massive stone slabs, each weighing many tons, that run from floor to roof and define the structural geometry of the entire interior. Modern stonemasons who have examined the chamber have remarked on the quality of the joinery, the consistency of the courses, the precision of the alignments. This was not built by amateurs. This was built by craftsmen of the highest order, by a society that valued and cultivated architectural skill across generations. And it was built for a purpose that, again, is not entirely clear. There is no evidence that Maes Howe was ever used as a primary burial site in the conventional sense. When it was opened in 1861, after Vikings had broken in centuries earlier, no original Neolithic remains were found inside. What its function actually was remains a matter of speculation. What is not speculative is its astronomical alignment. The entrance passage of Maes Howe is oriented so that, on the days around the winter solstice, the setting sun shines directly down the passage and illuminates the back wall of the central chamber. For a few minutes each evening, in the days surrounding the shortest day of the year, the deepest interior of the tomb is lit by direct sunlight. This is not an accident. The alignment is precise. Whoever built Maes Howe knew exactly what they were doing. They wanted the dying sun of the winter solstice to enter their stone chamber and touch the inner wall. They built the entire structure to make that brief annual moment happen. Whatever else Maes Howe was, it was a calendar, a marker of cosmic time, a place where human architecture was deliberately aligned with the turning of the celestial year. And this in a culture without writing, without metal, without wheels, on a remote North Atlantic island in 2800 BC. Just under 2 kilometers from Maes Howe, on the same narrow strip of land between the lochs of Stenness and Hooray, stands another extraordinary monument. The Ring of Brodgar is a great stone circle, originally consisting of 60 standing stones arranged in a near-perfect circle, 104 meters in diameter. 27 of those stones still stand today, some of them, several meters tall, set in a continuous circular ditch cut into the underlying bedrock. The ditch alone, like the ditch at Avebury, represents an enormous labor investment, cut through solid sandstone with bone and antler tools. The Ring of Brodgar was built around 2500 BC, contemporary with the Sarsen phase at Stonehenge, and although it is less famous than its southern counterpart, it is in some ways even more impressive. It is larger. It is more isolated. It sits in a landscape so vast and so visually overwhelming that the whole horizon becomes part of the monument. Less than a kilometre away across the strip of land, the older stones of Stenness still stand. This was probably the first of the major stone circles in this part of Orkney, built around 3100 BC, predating both the Ring of Brodgar and even most of Stonehenge. Only 4 of its original 12 stones remain upright, but those that survive are extraordinary, slim, sharp tablets of sandstone rising up to 6 meters into the sky. The stones of Stenness are part of the same ceremonial landscape as the Ring of Brodgar and Maes Howe, and together They define one of the most concentrated Neolithic ritual zones anywhere in Europe. Within a few hundred meters of each other stand a great chambered tomb of unmatched architectural quality, an early monumental stone circle, and a later vast stone ring, all of them aligned within a single sacred geography on a narrow neck of land between two locks. And then, in 2003, the geophysical surveys began finding something else. Beneath the green pasture between the stones of Stenness and the ring of Brodgar, on a low promontory now called the Ness of Brodgar, ground-penetrating radar revealed the buried outlines of structures unlike anything previously known from Neolithic Britain. Excavations began in 2004, led by Nick Card and the University of the Highlands and Islands, and they have been transforming our understanding of Neolithic Orkney ever since. What has emerged from the Ness of Brodgar is not a village in the ordinary sense, and not a single great monument. It is a complex of large stone buildings, some of them enormous, some of them with walls 4 or more meters thick, some of them decorated with carved geometric designs and traces of pigment, the whole site enclosed by massive walls of dressed stone. Some archaeologists have called it a temple complex. Others prefer terms like assembly site or ceremonial centre. Whatever it was, it had no real precedent in Northern Europe at the time it was built. The Ness of Brodgar was constructed beginning around 3300 BC and continued in active use for around 1,000 years before being deliberately closed down around 2300 BC, an event marked by the slaughter of around 400 cattle in what appears to have been a single enormous feast. The decoration at the Ness of Brodgar is what really shifts the picture. Many of the stones are incised with intricate geometric patterns, lozenges and chevrons and spirals, the same vocabulary that appears in megalithic art across Atlantic Europe. Several stones still bear traces of red, yellow, and orange pigments, indicating that the buildings were not the grey, unornamented spaces we tend to imagine when we think of Stone Age architecture. They were painted. They were decorated. They were spaces of visual richness, as well as ritual significance. Some of the largest structures at the Ness include central hearths, paved floors, and rows of side chambers, reminiscent of the layout of later Christian churches, although any such resemblance is presumably coincidental rather than directly ancestral. The scale of the Ness, the sophistication of its construction, the evidence of decorative elaboration, and the long duration of its use all point to a society far more complex and far more religiously developed than the standard textbook account of British prehistory allows. What was happening on those Orkney Islands in the late 4th and early 3rd millennium BC? Why was so much wealth, so much labour, so much creative energy being concentrated on this particular archipelago at this particular time? The honest answer is that we are still working it out. The Ness of Brodgar excavations have produced one of the largest collections of Neolithic art and decorated stone anywhere in Europe, and analysis is ongoing. What does seem clear is that Orkney was a generative centre, a place where the architectural and religious ideas that would later spread across Britain were developed and refined. The grooved ware pottery style that defines so much of the British late Neolithic, including the pottery found at Durrington Walls beside Stonehenge, appears to have originated in Orkney and spread southward. The basic concepts of the henge, the stone circle, and the chambered tomb appear to have been elaborated in Orkney before being adopted further south. The Neolithic of Britain may have been, in important ways, driven from its northern periphery rather than from the warmer south. The implications of this for how we understand cultural development in prehistoric Europe are still being worked out. We move further west still, to another set of islands off the Atlantic coast of Scotland, where stands one of the most striking stone monuments in all of Britain. The Callanish stones, or Calanaes in Gaelic, rise from a low ridge on the west coast of the Isle of Lewis in the Outer Hebrides. The central structure is a cross-shaped arrangement of standing stones with a tall central monolith, nearly 5 meters high, surrounded by a small stone circle with stone avenues and rows extending outward to the north, south, east, and west. The whole structure was raised between roughly 2,900 and 2,600 BC, during the same broad period as the major Orkney monuments. The Callanish stones are made of Lewisian gneiss, one of the oldest rocks on Earth, around 3 billion years old, and the natural banding and texture of the stones give them a distinctive striped appearance that has been used since the stones were first erected as part of their visual effect. The astronomy of Callanish is exceptional. The site was carefully positioned to interact with the movements of the moon as well as the sun. Every 18.5 years, during what astronomers call a major lunar standstill, the moon at its southern extreme rises and sets so low on the horizon that, from Callanish, it appears to skim along the line of distant hills to the south. The local landscape includes a range of hills whose silhouette is sometimes described in Hebridean tradition as the Old Woman or Cailleach na Mointich. During the major standstill, the moon appears to rise from this skyline, traverse along it, and then set into it, all within a single short arc. The stones at Callanish are positioned so that, from within the circle, the moonset of the major standstill falls precisely between specific stones in the southern row. This is not a coincidence. The site was designed for this particular astronomical event, an event that occurs only once every 18.5 years, and that requires careful generational observation to identify and predict. That a society without writing, without mathematics in any formal sense, without telescopes or precision instruments, was nevertheless able to track an astronomical cycle that takes nearly 2 decades to complete, and to build a permanent monument aligned to that cycle is one of the standing rebukes to the assumption that pre-Roman Britons were primitive. They were watching the sky with a patience and a precision that would not be matched in formal European astronomy until the late Middle Ages. They were doing it without paper. They were doing it without numbers as we understand them. They were doing it by passing knowledge from one generation to the next, through oral tradition, through ritual practice, through embodied calendars built into the landscape itself. The Callanish stones, like Maze Howe, like Stonehenge, like dozens of other sites we still do not fully understand, were instruments for an astronomy that was woven into religion, that was practiced as part of the deepest social life of the community. We travel south now, across the Irish Sea, to the island of Anglesey, off the coast of North Wales. Bryn Celli Dhu is the name of one of the most beautiful chambered tombs in Britain, its name in Welsh meaning roughly the mound in the dark grove. It was built around 3000 BC, on the site of an earlier henge, a place that had already been sacred for centuries before the stone chamber was constructed. The chamber itself is reached through a long stone passage, and the interior is roofed with massive capstones, supported by carefully placed uprights. Inside the chamber, the original Neolithic builders erected a smooth, carved stone pillar that has no obvious structural function. It is not load-bearing. It is not part of the wall. It is simply there, standing inside the chamber, a vertical presence at the heart of the tomb. Its purpose has never been satisfactorily explained. Like Maes Howe, Bryn Celli Dhu is aligned to a solar event, but it is the summer solstice rather than the winter. On the longest day of the year, the rising sun shines down the entrance passage and illuminates the back wall of the chamber, briefly bathing the interior in direct light. Recent surveys by the team of F. Fionn Reynolds and Adam Stanford have shown that the alignment is even more precise than was previously realized, with additional features in the surrounding landscape that may have functioned as foresights and backsights for the original observations. Outside the entrance to the tomb, the original Neolithic builders left a remarkable carved stone known as the pattern stone, an undecorated stone slab on the surface, but with elaborate flowing curved lines carved across its hidden upper face. Why the carving was placed where no one would normally see it remains one of the small, enduring puzzles of British Neolithic art. The current stone at the entrance is a replica, the original having been moved to the National Museum Wales in Cardiff for preservation. We move now to the Somerset Levels, a low-lying region of southwest England that in the Neolithic was a complex of reed beds, open water, and seasonally flooded marsh. In this watery landscape, around 6,000 years ago, the inhabitants of the surrounding higher ground built a network of timber trackways to allow them to cross the wet zones. The most famous of these is the Sweet Track, named for Ray Sweet, the peat cutter who discovered it in 1970. The Sweet Track is around 2 kilometers long, built of split oak planks laid end to end on top of crossed pegs driven into the peat, with shorter timbers of ash, lime, and hazel used as supports. Dendrochronological analysis has dated the track with extraordinary precision. The oak trees used to build it were felled in the winter of 3807 BC, or the early spring of 3806 BC. The track was, in other words, built in a single coordinated effort over a few months by a community that already had the carpentry skills, the woodland management knowledge, and the social organization to undertake such a project. The Sweet Track is one of the oldest engineered roads anywhere in the world. It is older than the pyramids by more than 1,300 years. It is older than Stonehenge in any of its phases. It is older than writing in most of the world. And it required, in its construction, a sophisticated understanding of timber processing. The oak planks were not cut by metal saws, since metal tools had not yet reached Britain in 3800 BC. They were split from large oak logs using wedges and mallets, a technique that requires considerable skill to execute well. The planks were then carried out across the marsh, the support pegs driven into place, and the planks laid down and notched into position. Items dropped or deliberately deposited along the track have been preserved by the anaerobic peat, and they include flint axes, pottery vessels, a jadeite axe from the Italian Alps, and various wooden objects. Some of these may have been accidental losses. Others appear to have been deliberate offerings, gifts to the waters or to the spirits of the wetland. The Sweet Track was a practical piece of infrastructure and also a ceremonial route. The two functions blended in a way that may be one of the deepest characteristics of prehistoric British religion. We move now eastward to the North Sea coast of Norfolk, where in the spring of 1998, the receding tide revealed an extraordinary structure that had been buried in coastal peat for over 4,000 years. What John Lorimer found, walking on Home Beach near the village of Home next the sea, was a circle of upright oak posts surrounding a single great inverted oak stump with its roots in the air. The site became known almost immediately by the media name Stonehenge. Its proper archaeological designation is Home 1. The timber circle, when fully exposed, consisted of 55 split oak trunks set vertically in a ring around 4.5 meters in diameter, their split faces turned inward. At the center of the ring stood the massive upside-down oak tree, its root system raised toward the sky like a dark crown. Dendrochronological analysis dated the timbers with the same kind of precision that had been achieved on the Sweet Track. The trees were felled in the spring, or early summer, of 2049 BC. The structure was built rapidly, perhaps within a few weeks, by a community that came to this coastal location specifically to construct it. At the time of its construction, the site was not on the shore. It was inland, in a salt marsh behind a coastal barrier. Only later did the sea encroach and bury the structure in peat, preserving it for 4,000 years until coastal erosion finally exposed it again. The purpose of Stonehenge is unknown. The most widely accepted theory is that it was a mortuary structure, perhaps used for the laying out of the dead, so that the body could be exposed and reduced before the bones were transferred elsewhere for burial. The inverted oak stump may have served as an altar or platform for this purpose. But the evidence is suggestive rather than conclusive. What is certain is that an entire community in early Bronze Age Norfolk made a decision to cut down a large oak tree, drag it to the marsh, invert it, and surround it with a careful ring of split posts, all within a few months. They had reasons, they had a religion, they had a worldview within which this made sense. We have only the wood. The excavation and removal of Stonehenge in 1999 was controversial. Local pagan groups and others argued that the timbers should be left in place to weather and decay as nature intended. English heritage and the archaeological community argued that the timbers would be destroyed by erosion within a few years, if not removed, and that the scientific information they could provide was irreplaceable. The timbers were removed, conserved, and are now on display at the Lynn Museum in King's Lynn, where they can be seen in the layout in which they originally stood. A second similar timber circle, Home 2, was discovered nearby shortly after Stonehenge itself, but it has been left in place to be destroyed by the sea. The two decisions representing the two different approaches to the question of what we owe to ancient sites and to the ancestors who built them. We return now to Salisbury Plain, to a site that for a long time stood in the shadow of its more famous neighbour, but that has, in recent decades, been revealed as one of the most important Neolithic discoveries in Europe. Durrington Walls lies around 3 kilometres northeast of Stonehenge, on the banks of the River Avon. It is a vast circular henge, around 500 meters across, enclosed by a massive ditch and external bank. For most of the 20th century, it was assumed to be a contemporary ceremonial site to Stonehenge, similar in function but built of timber rather than stone. The Durrington Walls Riverside Project, led by Mike Parker Pearson and a team of British and American archaeologists from 2003 onwards, transformed our understanding of what the site actually represented. What the excavations at Durrington Walls revealed was not just a ceremonial henge, but a substantial Neolithic settlement, possibly the largest yet discovered in northern Europe. Inside and around the Great Henge Bank lay the foundations of dozens of small houses, each roughly 5 meters square, built of timber walls plastered with chalk. The houses were clustered together, with paths and small courtyards between them. They contained central hearths, beds against the walls, and storage areas. The pottery, animal bones, and other domestic debris recovered from the houses indicates that they were occupied seasonally, probably for short, intense periods, by people who came from across a wide region of Britain. Strontium isotope analysis of the cattle teeth found in the middens at Durrington Walls has shown that the cattle were brought from as far away as Scotland and Wales, hundreds of kilometres distant, and slaughtered and eaten on site. The implication is profound. Durrington Walls was the construction camp for Stonehenge. It was where the workforce lived, ate, and held the great feasts that accompanied the building of the great stone monument 3 kilometres away. The pigs slaughtered at Durrington were killed mostly in midwinter, indicating that the major gathering periods at the site coincided with the winter solstice. People came from across Britain, brought cattle and pigs to feed themselves and their hosts, lived in temporary houses for weeks or months, contributed their labour to the construction of Stonehenge, participated in the great ceremonies, and then dispersed back to their own communities. The building of Stonehenge was, in this reading, not just an architectural project, but a recurring social event that bound the scattered communities of late Neolithic Britain together through shared work and shared ritual. A short distance from Durrington Walls, on a low slope above the same river, lies the smaller monument called Woodhenge. This was a timber circle of 6 concentric rings of posts, the outer ring around 40 meters in diameter, originally enclosed by a ditch and bank, similar in form to the smaller henges of the period. The post positions are now marked by short concrete pillars to allow visitors to visualize the structure, but in its original form, Woodhenge would have been an impressive monument in its own right, comparable in scale to the timber rings that the excavations at Durrington Walls have revealed inside the Great Henge itself. At the centre of Woodhenge, the original excavations in the 1920s by Maud Cunnington uncovered the burial of a young child, around 3 years old, with the skull split, apparently by a heavy blow. This was interpreted at the time as a ritual sacrifice, although the evidence is ambiguous and the remains were destroyed in the London Blitz in 1941 before modern analytical techniques could be applied. Woodhenge, in any case, was part of the same Stonehenge ceremonial complex, another node in the network of monuments that filled this stretch of Salisbury Plain in the late Neolithic. Around 2300 BC, the late Neolithic culture that had built Stonehenge, Durrington Walls, Woodhenge, Silbury Hill, and the other great monuments of southern Britain underwent a profound transformation. New people arrived from continental Europe, bringing new pottery styles, new burial practices, new metalworking technologies, and according to recent genetic studies, a genetic profile that almost entirely replaced the existing population of Britain within a few centuries. The newcomers are now known to archaeologists as the beaker culture, named for the distinctive bell-shaped pottery vessels they buried with their dead. Their arrival marks the transition from the late Neolithic to the early Bronze Age, and one of their early representatives in Britain has become so well known that he deserves his own section in this account. The Amesbury Archer was discovered in 2002 during construction work for a new housing development near the village of Amesbury, around 5 kilometres from Stonehenge. His grave was the richest single burial from the early Bronze Age yet found in Britain. He had been laid in his grave around 2300 BC, accompanied by an extraordinary collection of grave goods. There were 5 beaker pots, 16 flint arrowheads, 2 stone wrist guards used by archers, 2 gold hair ornaments, 3 copper knives, a kit of flint working tools, and a small stone anvil for working metal. His bones told their own story. He was around 40 years old at death. He had suffered a serious injury earlier in life that had left him with a damaged left knee and a bone infection. He walked with a limp. The isotope analysis of his tooth enamel revealed that he had grown up not in Britain, but in the Alpine region of Central Europe, probably in what is now Switzerland or southern Germany. He was, in other words, an immigrant. A man born and raised in the Alps who, sometime in his adult life, had made the long journey across continental Europe to Britain, bringing with him the metalworking knowledge that would help launch the British Bronze Age. He died near Stonehenge during the Great Sarsen building phase of the monument. He was buried with the wealth and the respect due to someone of considerable status. A second man, the so-called companion of the Avebury archer, was buried nearby a few years later. Tooth and bone analysis showed that the companion had been born in Britain, but he shared a rare congenital trait with the archer, a fusion of certain bones in the foot, indicating that the two men were biologically related, probably as father and son or as uncle and nephew. The Amesbury archer was the first generation, the immigrant. The companion was the second generation, the son born in the new land. Together, they offer a snapshot of the kind of population movement that was reshaping Britain in the centuries around 2300 BC. The arrival of the Beaker people and the new Bronze Age culture they brought did not end monument building in Britain. It changed it. The great communal henges and stone circles of the late Neolithic were gradually replaced as the dominant form of ritual architecture by individual round barrows, the burial mounds of named ancestors. The landscape of Salisbury Plain alone contains around 450 Bronze Age round barrows, many of them clustered in cemeteries that line the ridges around Stonehenge. The dead were now buried as individuals, with their own grave goods, marked by their own mounds, rather than being placed in collective chambered tombs, where bones mixed with the bones of generations of relatives. The shift from collective to individual burial reflects, in the view of many archaeologists, a deeper shift in how society was organized, from kinship-based communal groups to hierarchical lineages with individual leaders whose status was inherited and displayed in death. Before we continue further into the Bronze Age and Iron Age periods of pre-Roman Britain, I want to take a moment to thank you for listening this far. If you are finding this useful, please do consider subscribing to the channel if you have not already done so, and sharing this video with anyone you know who appreciates serious, long-form historical content. These documentaries take many hours of research and writing to produce, and the channel grows entirely through word-of-mouth recommendations from listeners like you. Every share genuinely matters. Now, let us continue, because there is a great deal still to cover, and some of the most extraordinary discoveries in pre-Roman British archaeology have only come to light in the last few decades. We move now from southern England to the fens of East Anglia, the low marshy region around Peterborough, where, in the late 20th century, two extraordinary Bronze Age sites were excavated and have transformed our understanding of life in late prehistoric Britain. The first of these is Flag Fen. Flag Fen was discovered in 1982 by the archaeologist Francis Pryor, who noticed a row of timber posts protruding from the bottom of a dike during routine fieldwork. Excavation over the following years revealed an extraordinary structure. A causeway of around 1 million timbers, mostly oak and ash, had been driven into the fen between roughly 1300 BC and 900 BC. The causeway ran for more than a kilometre across the wetland, connecting an area of dry land called Fengate with a low island in the marsh now called Northay. At a central point along the causeway, a platform had been built, and around this platform an extraordinary collection of metalwork had been deliberately deposited. The Flag Fen metalwork includes swords, daggers, spearheads, pins, brooches, axe heads, and shears, many of them deliberately broken before being thrown into the water. Some of the items came from as far afield as continental Europe and Iberia. The total quantity is staggering, several hundred bronze objects representing an enormous accumulation of value in the metal economy of the late Bronze Age. They were not lost. They were not hidden for later recovery. They were given. They were sacrificed. They were placed into the dark water of the fen as offerings to whatever powers the late Bronze Age inhabitants of the region believed inhabited it. The same general pattern of metalwork deposition in watery places is found across late Bronze Age Europe, from Ireland to Switzerland to Hungary. But flagfen is one of the most concentrated examples yet discovered. It speaks of a religion in which water, fens, lakes, and rivers were liminal places where the human world met something else, and in which gifts to that something else took the form of the most valuable objects the community could produce. A short distance from Flagfen, in 1999, quarrying work at Must Farm revealed what would become one of the most spectacularly preserved Bronze Age sites anywhere in Europe. Must Farm is a brickworks quarry near Whittlesea in Cambridgeshire, where the cutting of clay for brick manufacture exposed first one and then several waterlogged Bronze Age boats, hollowed out from single oak trunks, abandoned in an ancient river channel. Subsequent investigation by the Cambridge Archaeological Unit, led by Mark Knight, expanded into a major excavation project from 2015 to 2016. What emerged was a complete settlement, frozen in time by the conditions of a catastrophic fire and subsequent waterlogging, dating to around 850 BC. The Must Farm settlement consisted of at least 5 roundhouses built on a platform of timber piles over a slow-flowing river. The houses were stilted dwellings above the water, connected by walkways. Sometime around 850 BC, the entire settlement caught fire, possibly through accident, possibly through hostile attack. The burning houses collapsed into the water and silt below them. The fire incinerated some materials but preserved others by quickly carbonizing them and burying them in anaerobic mud. The result is an archaeological snapshot of Bronze Age domestic life of unprecedented completeness. Inside the collapsed houses were complete sets of cooking pots, some still containing the carbonized remains of meals that were being prepared at the moment of the disaster. There were textiles, including some of the finest preserved fragments of Bronze Age cloth ever recovered. There were wooden tools, bone tools, antler tools, glass beads from the Mediterranean, amber beads from the Baltic, and an entire ash wood bucket containing the carbonized remains of a stew. The picture that emerges from Must Farm is of Bronze Age British villagers who were not in any sense isolated or primitive. They had connections that extended across continental Europe, with beads from the Mediterranean and the Baltic, with bronze ingots from continental sources, with textile technologies and pottery styles that fitted into a broader Atlantic European pattern. They lived in well-built homes. They ate varied diets that included grain porridges, meat stews, and freshwater fish. They wore patterned cloth woven on warp-weighted looms. They had tools for every domestic task. They had storage vessels for grain and other foodstuffs. They had art and ornament. They had, in short, the kind of complete and complex domestic culture that we would recognize from any peasant village of the European Middle Ages, except that they had it nearly 3,000 years earlier. The destruction of Must Farm, and the preservation of its contents, has provided British archaeology with one of its most important single sites of recent decades. The conservation and analysis of the material is still continuing. New publications appear regularly. The site has been called the Pompeii of the British Bronze Age, an analogy that captures something of the unusual preservation conditions, although the scale and the time period are very different. What Must Farm tells us, perhaps above all, is how much we have lost from the Bronze Age elsewhere in Britain. The settlements we usually study are those that were occupied long enough for their contents to decay and disappear. Must Farm preserves what a normal Bronze Age village actually had inside it, and the answer is that it had a great deal, far more than the impoverished remains of conventional dry land sites would suggest. We turn now to a different category of pre-Roman British construction. Some of the most distinctive monuments in the British landscape are not made of stone or timber, but of chalk, carved into the hillsides themselves. The Uffington White Horse is the most famous of these. It is a stylized depiction of a horse, around 110 meters long, cut into the chalk of a hill called White Horse Hill, in the Vale of the White Horse in Oxfordshire. The figure is created by removing the turf from the underlying chalk in trenches that have been kept clean by regular maintenance for nearly 3,000 years. The minimalist flowing lines of the horse, with its stretched body, beaked head, and curiously detached limbs, give it an almost abstract quality that distinguishes it from any other ancient hill figure in Britain. The Uffington White Horse was traditionally assumed to be either Saxon or possibly Roman in date, until, in 1995, the Oxford Archaeological Unit used a technique called optically stimulated luminescence to date the chalk that had silted into the trenches at the base of the figure. The result was startling. The horse was first cut into the hillside between roughly 1380 BC and 550 BC, with the most likely date in the late Bronze Age. The figure was therefore made by the same general culture that built Flag Fen and Must Farm around 3,000 years ago and has been continuously maintained by the local community ever since. For 3 millennia, the people of the Vale of the White Horse have gone up to the hill every few years and scoured the figure clean, removing the encroaching grass and recutting the trenches. This is one of the longest continuously maintained pieces of public art in the world. Every horse you see when you look at the White Horse on Uffington Hill is, in a sense, the same horse that the Bronze Age inhabitants of the region first cut into the chalk in the centuries before 1000 BC. What the White Horse meant to its original makers is unknown. There has been speculation that it was a tribal emblem, a religious symbol, a depiction of a horse goddess, a marker of territory, an offering to the sun. The hill on which it stands has an ancient hill fort at its summit called Uffington Castle and a strange artificial flat mound called Dragon Hill at its base, where local legend says St. George killed the dragon, the white spot of chalk on the summit being the place where the dragon's blood killed the grass. All these later traditions have grown up around an ancient figure whose original meaning was lost long before any of them began. The horse remains. We look at it. We do not understand it. We maintain it anyway, generation after generation, an act of cultural transmission that has continued across the entire arc of recorded British history and well before its beginning. The Uffington White Horse is the only large prehistoric hill figure in Britain whose date is securely established. The Surna Abbas giant in Dorset, the famous nude figure with the great club, has been more controversial. For centuries it was assumed to be either Romano, British, or much later, possibly even early modern in origin. In 2021, the National Trust released the results of a luminescence dating program that suggested the giant was originally cut into the chalk in the late Saxon period, sometime between 700 and 1100 AD, much later than the Uffington horse. But the dating remains a matter of ongoing analysis. And even if the giant is post-Roman in date, his existence reminds us that the British tradition of cutting figures into chalk hillsides is a long and continuous one, with roots that may extend deeper into prehistory than even the Uffington horse suggests. There may have been many more such figures in pre-Roman Britain that have been lost through neglect, the chalk silting up and the grass returning, the figures forgotten before they could be recorded. We move now to consider the Iron Age proper, the period roughly from 800 BC to the Roman invasion of 43 AD, when a new wave of social, technological, and military developments transformed the British landscape yet again. The most visible architectural legacy of the British Iron Age is the hill fort. There are around 4,000 of them in Britain, scattered across the upland regions of England, Wales, and Scotland. They range from small enclosures of less than half a hectare to enormous multi-vallate fortresses covering tens of hectares. The largest of them are extraordinary engineering achievements, ringed by ramparts and ditches that required the movement of millions of tons of earth and rock. They were built by communities that had no central government, no professional engineers, no formal architectural training, working with Iron Age hand tools and the muscle of free farmers and their labourers. Maiden Castle in Dorset is the most famous of the British hill forts. It sits on a chalk ridge a few kilometres from Dorchester and covers around 18 hectares within its inner enclosure. The total area within the outer ramparts is around 47 hectares. The defensive system consists of multiple concentric ramparts and ditches, the ramparts in their original form rising up to 20 metres from the bottom of the ditches in front of them. The entrances are elaborately defended by overlapping curtain walls, with passages forced to turn at sharp angles so that attackers exposed their unshielded right sides to defenders on the ramparts. The whole structure was built and rebuilt across centuries of Iron Age occupation, with the earliest enclosure on the site dating back to the early Neolithic around 4000 BC, the first major hill fort phase around 600 BC, and the great multivallate ramparts, taking their final form around 100 BC. The construction of Maiden Castle in its final phase has been estimated to have required around 400,000 cubic meters of chalk and earth to be moved, an effort comparable in scale to many of the Great Pyramids of Egypt. The chalk was dug from the ditches with iron tools, hauled up the developing ramparts in baskets, and packed in place. The slopes were faced with timber or possibly with sods to prevent erosion. The whole project must have taken many years of intermittent labor by a community working on it during the agricultural off-seasons. And Maiden Castle is only one of many comparable sites across Britain. Cadbury Castle in Somerset, Old Oswestry in Shropshire, Maiden Bower in Bedfordshire, Egerton Hill in Dorset, Hambledon Hill nearby, the great series of hill forts along the Welsh borders, all of them represent comparable investments of labour and engineering skill. The Iron Age British were, collectively, the most prolific hill fort builders in European prehistory. The function of the hill forts has been debated for as long as they have been studied. The traditional view was that they were primarily defensive, refuges against external attack in times of conflict. This view drew partly on the dramatic image of the Roman assault on Maiden Castle in 43 AD, when the future Emperor Vespasian led the Second Legion against the great hill fort and overwhelmed it, with bodies of the British defenders later found buried in a war cemetery near the Eastern Gate. But more recent analysis has suggested that the hill forts were more than just military structures. They were also political centers, the seats of power of local elites, the assembly places of tribes, the storage places of communal grain, the venues for markets and feasts, and religious ceremonies. The defensive function was real but not exclusive. The hill forts were the visible expression of social and political organization in Iron Age Britain, the architectural form taken by power and community in this period. Some of the hill forts were tightly packed with Iron Age roundhouses, indicating dense occupation. Others were largely empty inside, suggesting they were used periodically rather than as permanent residences. Different regions show different patterns. The hill forts of southern England tend to be the largest and most elaborate, while those of Scotland and Wales are often smaller but no less carefully constructed. The hill forts of the Welsh borders, in particular, are extraordinarily numerous, with hundreds of small forts crowning the hills of Shropshire and Herefordshire, suggesting a landscape of competing local communities, each defended by its own fortress. Whatever the regional variations, the basic pattern is clear. By the late Iron Age, the British landscape was punctuated by thousands of fortified hilltop sites, the visible centers of a society organized into tribes and confederations, sophisticated, militarily capable, and economically integrated into the wider European world. We move now to consider one of the most enigmatic categories of prehistoric British art and inscription. Across the uplands of northern England, southern Scotland, and parts of Ireland, ancient outcrops and standing stones are covered with carved patterns of circles, dots, and grooves. These are called cup and ring marks, and they represent some of the most widespread, but least understood, prehistoric rock art in Europe. A typical cup and ring mark consists of a small circular depression cut into the rock, surrounded by one or more concentric carved rings, sometimes connected by a groove running outward from the central cup. They were made by pecking, chiseling, and grinding the rock surface with stone tools, and they vary in scale from small marks a few centimeters across to elaborate panels covering several square meters. The oldest cup and ring marks in Britain date back to the late Neolithic, around 3,500 BC, and the tradition continued into the Bronze Age, perhaps as late as 1,500 BC. They are found in clusters in specific regions, particularly in Northumberland, in the Galloway region of southwest Scotland, in the high moors of Yorkshire, and on the Argyll Peninsula in western Scotland. Some are on portable boulders. Many are on flat exposed outcrops on hilltops, with sweeping views. Some are inside chambered tombs, including the great chambered tomb at Hendraburnick down in Cornwall, where the carved surface was found face down inside the tomb, the carvings invisible from the inside, but presumably significant to those who placed the stone in position. What do they mean? The honest answer, again, is that nobody knows. There are theories. They have been interpreted as maps of stars, as representations of the sun, as territorial markers, as records of celestial events, as fertility symbols, as records of ritual journeys. as the visible traces of trance experiences during shamanic ceremonies. Some researchers have noted that the cup and ring marks often appear on stones with significant views over the surrounding landscape, suggesting that the act of carving them may have been part of a ritual engagement with specific places. Others have noted that many of the marks are on portable stones and could have been carried, exchanged, or deposited in significant locations. The cup and ring marks belong to a symbolic vocabulary that was clearly meaningful to the people who made them, that was passed down across many generations, that was used consistently across vast geographical areas. We can describe them, we can map them, we can date them, we cannot read them. The script, if it is a script, has not been deciphered and likely never will be. In the far north of the country, in the high hills of Cumbria, stand two of the most evocative stone circles in all of England. Longmeg and her daughters is the third largest stone circle in England, around 100 meters in diameter, consisting of around 59 standing stones arranged in a slightly flattened ring. The whole circle is set on a low rise in the rolling countryside near the village of Little Salkeld, in a setting of quiet farmland that has changed less over the centuries than many archaeological landscapes elsewhere in England. Just outside the circle stands a single tall outlier, a slender red sandstone pillar about 3.5 meters high, known as Long Meg herself. The other stones in the circle, called her daughters in the local tradition, are predominantly of grey granite, smaller and more roughly shaped than the imposing red sandstone outlier. Long Meg is decorated with carvings. On the face of the great red sandstone pillar are several cup and ring marks, including a particularly fine spiral, all of them facing into the circle. These are among the most striking examples of late Neolithic rock art in Britain in their setting, integrated into a monumental architectural composition that aligns Long Meg herself with the winter solstice sunset, as observed from the center of the circle. On the shortest day of the year, the sun sets directly behind Long Meg, the carved stone catching the last red light of the dying year. The carvings, the stone, the circle, and the astronomical alignment are all parts of a single composition, designed and executed by builders who clearly knew exactly what they were doing. A short journey to the west, in the Central Lake District, stands one of the most beautifully sited stone circles anywhere in Europe. Castlerigg Stone Circle sits on a low plateau near the town of Keswick, surrounded on every horizon by the dramatic peaks of the Lake District Mountains. The circle is around 30 meters in diameter and consists of 38 stones, with an additional rectangular setting of stones inside the circle on the eastern side, whose purpose has never been satisfactorily explained. The stones are of local volcanic rock, set into the turf of the plateau, framed against the mountain ridges of Skiddaw, Helvellyn, and the High Rig Fells. The circle dates to around 3000 BC, putting it among the earliest stone circles in Britain, contemporary with the first phases of Stonehenge. What makes Castlerigg so remarkable is the integration of the monument with its setting. The stones of the circle echo the peaks on the surrounding horizon. Various alignments link individual stones to notches and summits in the mountain skyline, with some appearing to mark astronomical events, while others may have marked sacred mountains, springs, or distant landmarks. The whole composition demonstrates a sophisticated understanding of how a built structure could be designed to engage with a natural landscape, transforming a particular spot in the hills into a center of attention, a focus of meaning, a stage on which the seasonal drama of the sun and the eternal presence of the mountains could be ritualized and experienced. Castlerigg was, as much as any of the more famous monuments further south, a religious instrument tuned to the cosmos. We move now to consider some of the human remains that survive from pre-Roman Britain, because the most direct contact we can have with the people of that period is with their bodies. In the peat bogs of northern Britain and Ireland, a number of remarkable bog bodies have been recovered over the past 2 centuries, preserved by the unique chemistry of the peat. The most famous of the British bog bodies is Lindo Man, who was discovered in 1,984 inches Lindo Moss, near the village of Wilmslow in Cheshire. He was found in fragments by peat cutters, and the subsequent recovery and analysis of his remains has provided one of the most detailed pictures of a pre-Roman British death that we possess. Lindo Man was a young adult, probably in his mid-20s, well-built, around 170 centimeters tall. He had been killed sometime in the late Iron Age, or possibly the early Roman period, with radiocarbon dating placing his death around the 1st or 2nd century AD. The manner of his death was complex and violent. He had been struck twice on the head with a heavy object, with sufficient force to shatter his skull. He had been garroted with a knotted cord around his neck, the tightening cord breaking his neck. His throat had been cut. He had been stabbed in the chest. The combination of injuries, sometimes called the threefold death, has been interpreted by some scholars as evidence of a ritual sacrifice, perhaps following a specific pattern recorded in later Celtic mythology, in which the victim was killed in 3 ways simultaneously. Others have proposed that he was a high-status individual who was executed for some offense, or perhaps a war captive, ritually killed in a religious ceremony. His last meal, preserved in his stomach, included unleavened bread containing the seeds of various plants, including mistletoe pollen, suggesting a possible link to Druidic religious practice. Since mistletoe was sacred to the Druids, according to the Roman writer Pliny the Elder, he wore only a fox fur armband and was otherwise naked when killed. His face had been carefully painted before his death, with traces of red pigment still detectable on his skin. Whatever the precise circumstances, Lindo Man died as part of an event that involved careful preparation, deliberate ritual, and violent ceremony, and his body was then placed in the bog, where the cold acid water preserved him for nearly 2,000 years, until peat-cutting machines accidentally exposed him in the 1980s. He is now in the British Museum, where his preserved face still bears traces of expression, his eyes closed, his mouth slightly open, his last hours captured in flesh and bog water across the centuries. We move now back to the very beginning of human presence in post-glacial Britain, to one of the most extraordinary Mesolithic sites yet found in northern Europe. Star Carr lies on the edge of what was once a large, shallow lake in North Yorkshire, called Lake Flixton by archaeologists, now long since drained and reduced to peat. Star Carr was first excavated in the late 1940s by Graham Clark of Cambridge University. He recognized that the waterlogged peat had preserved organic materials that would have been destroyed elsewhere, and the site has continued to yield remarkable finds in subsequent decades of excavation by other teams. Star Carr dates to around 9000 BC, just a few thousand years after the end of the last ice age. The people who came to its shores were hunter-gatherers, working with flint tools, hunting deer and aurochs and wild boar, fishing the lake, and constructing one of the earliest known wooden platforms on the British landmass. The wooden platform at Star Carr is older than any comparable structure yet known from Britain or northwest Europe. It consists of split timber planks laid out on the wet ground at the lake edge, providing a stable surface for activities that could not be carried out directly on the soft peat. Around this platform was an extraordinary deposition of objects. More than 200 barbed antler points have been recovered from Star Carr, used as spear or harpoon tips for hunting and fishing. Most strikingly, around 21 red deer antler frontlets have been found, with the bone-shaped and the eye sockets carefully drilled through, evidently intended to be worn as headdresses by people performing some kind of dance, ritual, or hunting ceremony. The Star Carr antler headdresses are among the oldest examples of ritual costume from anywhere in Europe, providing a direct material connection to the religious life of Mesolithic Britain that no other site has yet matched. The implication is that even at the very beginning of the post-glacial period, even before farming, even before pottery, the hunter-gatherers of Britain were already organizing themselves into communities that built substantial structures, that practiced complex ritual ceremonies, and that left material evidence of a rich symbolic and religious life. The image of Mesolithic hunters as wandering nomads with no fixed settlements and no complex culture has been steadily eroded by sites like Star Carr. The Mesolithic peoples of Britain were sophisticated, settled in their seasonal rounds, and culturally elaborated. They were already, in important ways, the people who would build Stonehenge and Avebury several thousand years later, their descendants and inheritors. We need to take a moment now to consider Doggerland in more detail, because the lost land beneath the North Sea is one of the great hidden chapters of prehistoric British and European history. At the height of the last ice age, around 20,000 years ago, sea levels were around 120 meters lower than they are today, And what is now the floor of the North Sea was a vast plain stretching from northern England across to Denmark and the Netherlands. As the ice sheets melted and sea levels rose, this plain was gradually drowned, but for thousands of years it remained habitable, supporting forests, rivers, lakes, herds of deer and aurochs, and the human communities that lived among them. Doggerland was not a marginal landscape. Recent reconstructions, drawing on seismic surveys, sediment cores, and modelling work, led by researchers including Vincent Gaffney at Bradford University, suggest that Doggerland may have been one of the richest hunting grounds in post-glacial Europe. The plain was crossed by major rivers, with the rivers that now empty into the North Sea from the Rhine and the Thames and the Humber once joining together to form a much larger river system. There were lakes, estuaries, marshes, and the kind of varied wetland environment that supports very high densities of wildlife. The human population of Doggerland is unknown, but may have been substantial. Tens of thousands of Mesolithic flint tools and bones have been dredged up from the North Sea floor by fishing trawlers over the past century, including the famous Kalinda harpoon found in the 1930s, a barbed antler point of Mesolithic type that came up in a fishing net more than 30 kilometers from the nearest coast. The end of Doggerland came in two phases. First, the slow rise of sea levels through the early Holocene gradually drowned the lowest parts of the plain. Then, around 6200 BC, a catastrophic event called the Storegga Slide caused a massive submarine landslide off the coast of Norway, which triggered a tsunami that swept across the North Sea basin. The tsunami may have reached heights of 20 meters or more along the coasts of Doggerland and the surrounding regions, and modelling suggests that it would have inundated vast areas of low-lying land within hours. The Storegga tsunami may have killed thousands of people and displaced thousands more, and it may have been the event that finally severed Britain from the European continent, transforming the last remaining land connections into the open waters of the modern North Sea. We do not know what stories the survivors told about that day. We do not know what gods they prayed to as the waters rose. We do not know what they did with their dead, or where they buried them, or whether the trauma of the Great Flood entered the oral traditions of the surrounding peoples and persisted for generations afterward. What we know is that the event happened, that an entire inhabited landscape was destroyed within a single human lifetime, and that the survivors who washed up on the coasts of what is now eastern England and the Netherlands had to rebuild their lives in a changed world. The making of Britain, as an island, was a violent event, not a slow geographical inevitability. The people who built Stonehenge and Avebury 2,000 years later were the descendants of survivors of the Great Drowning. We move now to consider a particular category of late Iron Age artifact that has come to symbolize the wealth, the artistry, and the international connections of pre-Roman Britain. The Snettisham hoards were found in a series of discoveries between 1,948 and 1,992 inches afield near the village of Snettisham in Norfolk. Over the course of these excavations, around 230 kilograms of gold, silver, and bronze objects were recovered, including more than 200 complete or fragmentary torques, the heavy twisted neck rings that were the most distinctive personal ornament of late Iron Age Celtic Europe. The Snettisham hoards represent the largest single concentration of Iron Age precious metal yet recovered anywhere in Europe, and they have transformed our understanding of the economy and the religious practice of late Iron Age Britain. The most famous individual object from Snettisham is the Great Torque, a heavy gold and silver alloy neck ring made of 8 twisted strands of metal, each strand itself made of 8 twisted wires. The terminals at each end of the torque are elaborately decorated with cast, spiral, and curvilinear designs in the distinctive style of late Iron Age Celtic art. The Great Torque weighs over 1 kilogram of precious metal and would have been an object of extraordinary value in the late Iron Age economy, probably the personal regalia of a high-status individual, perhaps a tribal leader or a religious officiant. It dates to around 75 BC, in the final century before the Roman conquest, and it represents the technical and artistic peak of British Iron Age metalwork. But the Great Torque is only one of many similar objects from the Snettisham hoards. What the assemblage as a whole demonstrates is that late Iron Age, Britain was a society of accumulated wealth, of skilled specialist craftsmen, of long-distance trade in precious metals, and of religious or political practices that involved the deliberate burial of vast quantities of treasure. The Snettisham hoards were buried in pits in the ground, with some talks carefully wrapped or stacked, while others appear to have been thrown in casually. The pattern suggests deliberate deposition rather than concealment for later recovery, although this remains debated. If the hoards were religious offerings, they represent a level of investment in ritual practice that is staggering by any standard. If they were caches that were never recovered, they represent a wealth so abundant that even hundreds of kilograms of gold could be hidden and forgotten by the descendants of those who hid it. We move now to the rivers of late Iron Age Britain, where another category of remarkable objects was deliberately deposited in watery places. The Battersea Shield was recovered from the River Thames near Battersea Bridge in London in 1857 during dredging operations to deepen the river. It is one of the most important pieces of Iron Age metalwork ever found in Britain. The shield is a bronze facing that would have been attached to a wooden backing around 70 centimeters long, decorated with 3 roundels containing intricate curvilinear designs in repoussé and engraving, set with red glass studs that originally would have stood out vividly against the polished bronze. The whole composition is in the High Latin style, the most elaborate phase of late Iron Age Celtic art, dating to around 350 to 50 BC. The Battersea Shield was found in the river, almost certainly placed there deliberately. It was not a functional shield in the practical sense. The metal facing is too thin to have stopped a sword blow, and it shows no signs of combat damage. It was a ceremonial object, made to be carried, displayed, and ultimately offered to the river. The pattern of deliberate metal deposition in rivers and lakes is found across the late Iron Age of Britain and continental Europe, with rivers including the Thames, the Witham, the Tyne, and the Severn yielding extraordinary collections of weapons, ornaments, and ceremonial regalia. The Witham shield, the Waterloo helmet, the Wandsworth mask shield boss, all came from British rivers. The pattern is so consistent and so widespread that it cannot be explained by accidental loss. The Iron Age British were giving their finest objects to the rivers, just as their Bronze Age predecessors had given offerings to the fens. Among the most striking single objects from this tradition is the Battersea cauldron, sometimes called the Battersea Shield's neighbour. But the more famous example is the Gundestrup cauldron, which was found in Denmark rather than Britain, but which depicts scenes that may relate to British Iron Age religious practice. Closer to home, the great gold torques from Ipswich, the Witham shield with its elegant elongated boss, and the so-called Aylesford bucket from Kent, with its riveted bronze bands depicting horses and human figures, all represent the wealth and the artistic sophistication of the late Iron Age British world. This was not a society of impoverished tribesmen waiting for Roman civilization. This was a society at the height of its own artistic and material culture, producing objects that hold their own against the finest work of any other contemporary European culture. We move now to consider one of the most distinctive types of Iron Age structure found anywhere in the British Isles. The Brocks of Scotland are massive, circular, dry stone towers, built without mortar, that stand mostly in the islands and northern coasts of Scotland. There are around 500 broch sites known, most of them now reduced to low circular footings, but some are still standing to remarkable heights. The most complete surviving broch is Musa Broch in the Shetland Islands. It still stands to a height of around 13 meters, making it the tallest prehistoric building in the British Isles. It was built around 100 BC in the late Iron Age by a community of skilled stoneworkers who designed and constructed it with extraordinary care. The broch design is unique in European architecture. The walls are double, consisting of an outer skin and an inner skin separated by a hollow space. Within this hollow wall, a stone staircase spirals up to the top of the building. Galleries run around the inside of the wall at intervals, providing internal access without weakening the structural integrity of the outer skin. The base of the wall is solid, but as the broch rises, the hollow construction reduces the weight of the upper walls and allows the structure to reach heights that would not be possible with conventional solid wall construction. The whole design represents a sophisticated engineering response to the challenge of building tall, defensible, weatherproof structures with the limited resources available in the islands of northern Scotland. The function of the brochs has been debated for over a century. The traditional view was that they were defensive towers, refuges against Viking-style raids by neighboring communities. More recent analysis has emphasized their probable role as elite residences, the homes of high-status families who needed to project their importance through monumental architecture. Some brocks were surrounded by smaller, dependent buildings, forming small settlements with a central tower dominating a cluster of associated houses. Others stood alone, often in coastal locations with commanding views over the surrounding seas. Whatever their precise function, the brocks represent one of the most distinctive architectural traditions in pre-Roman Europe, a regional architectural style that developed in a particular environmental and social context, and that produced buildings that have lasted, in some cases, for over 2,000 years. We move now to consider another type of late Iron Age settlement that has only recently been fully appreciated for its sophistication. The crannogs are artificial islands built in the lochs of Scotland and Ireland, typically constructed by piling rocks, timber, and brushwood in the shallow water along the edges of lakes until a small island has been created. Houses were then built on top of the artificial island, often connected to the shore by a causeway that could be removed or blocked in times of danger. There are several thousand crannog sites known in Scotland and Ireland, dating from the Bronze Age through to the early medieval period, and in a few cases, up to the 17th century. The Scottish Crannog Centre at Loch Tay in Perthshire built a full-scale reconstruction of an Iron Age crannog in the 1990s, based on the detailed excavation of the Oakbank Crannog nearby. The reconstructed building, which sadly burned down in a fire in 2021 and is being rebuilt, allowed visitors to experience what it was like to live on one of these artificial islands. The interior was warm, dry, and surprisingly spacious. The smoke from the central hearth escaped through a hole in the conical thatched roof. The walls of the house were lined with sleeping platforms and storage areas. The whole structure was supported on substantial timber piles driven into the lakebed, with a floor of split logs above the water. Living on a crannog meant being constantly aware of the water below, the surrounding loch and the distant shoreline, the world of land and the world of water meeting at the threshold of your front door. The crannogs were not just defensive structures, although their position in the water clearly provided some protection. They were also expressions of a particular relationship between human communities and the landscape, a way of inhabiting the meeting place between earth and water, between the everyday world and the watery places where the gods and the ancestors were believed to dwell. The placement of a house in the middle of a loch was, in some sense, a religious act as well as a practical one. The crannog dwellers lived in the liminal zone where the Bronze Age inhabitants of Flag Fen had thrown their swords into the dark water, where the late Iron Age British had cast the Battersea Shield into the Thames. They lived on the edge of the other world, on islands of their own making. We move now to a different category of late Iron Age site that has produced some of the most unsettling evidence yet recovered for the religious practices of pre-Roman Britain. At Stanwick in North Yorkshire, in the territory of the powerful Brigantes tribe, lie the remains of one of the largest Iron Age oppida, or proto-urban centres, in northern Britain. The site covers around 300 hectares within its defensive earthworks, and it served as the political centre of the Brigantes Confederation in the 1st century AD, before and during the Roman conquest of northern England. Excavations by Mortimer Wheeler in the 1950s, and by later teams, have produced extensive evidence of late Iron Age occupation, including remains that hint at the kinds of ritual practices that the Romans found so disturbing about the British and Gaulish religious tradition. A skull recovered from the Stanwick site shows clear evidence of having been displayed, probably nailed to a doorpost or a gatepost, after the death of its owner. Similar evidence of head display has been found at other Iron Age sites across Britain and continental Celtic Europe. The Roman writer Diodorus Siculus, drawing on earlier Greek sources, described how the Gauls cut off the heads of their defeated enemies, attached them to the necks of their horses, and brought them home to be hung on the gateposts of their houses or embalmed in cedar oil and displayed to visitors. The heads of the most distinguished enemies were preserved with particular care and brought out as treasured possessions to be shown off. Whether this practice was widespread in Britain is uncertain, but the archaeological evidence from Stanwick and other sites suggests that something similar was indeed happening in Iron Age Britain, at least in some communities and on some occasions. We move now to the southwest of England to consider a less famous but in some ways equally remarkable complex of stone circles that has only recently begun to receive the attention it deserves. Stanton Drew in Somerset contains 3 stone circles arranged in a deliberate spatial relationship to each other, along with associated avenues and outlying stones. The largest of the 3 circles, the Great Circle, is 113 metres in diameter, second only to Avebury among British stone circles. It originally contained around 30 large stones, of which around 27 now survive. The Northeast Circle and the Southwest Circle are smaller satellite circles set close to the Great Circle and linked to it by short stone avenues that appear to have led ceremonial processions between the 3 monuments. For most of the 20th century, Stanton Drew was relatively neglected by archaeological research, overshadowed by Stonehenge and Avebury further east. In 1997, English Heritage conducted a geophysical survey of the site, and the results transformed our understanding of what Stanton Drew actually represented. Beneath the visible stone circles, the survey detected the outlines of a vast complex of buried pits arranged in concentric rings inside the Great Circle. 9 concentric rings of pits were detected, each pit large enough to have held a substantial timber post, the whole pattern of post holes forming a structure that may have been one of the largest timber rings ever constructed in the British Neolithic. The Great Circle at Stanton Drew, in other words, was not just a stone circle. It was originally a vast timber monument, possibly enclosed by an outer henge bank and ditch, on top of which the surviving stone circle was a later addition. The implications of the Stanton Drew survey are still being worked through. If the timber rings were standing simultaneously with each other, they would represent a monumental wooden structure on a scale that has few parallels anywhere in Neolithic Europe. The geometry of the rings appears to be carefully calculated, with consistent spacing between the rings and a deliberate relationship between the timber structure and the outer stone circle that replaced or supplemented it. Whether the original wooden monument was roofed, like the great roundhouses of the Iron Age, or open to the sky, like a forest of upright posts, is currently unknown. Future excavation may answer some of these questions, but for now, Stanton Drew stands as a reminder that the spectacular discoveries of British Neolithic archaeology are not all in the past. New sites and new dimensions of known sites are still being identified, and our picture of what the late Stone Age inhabitants of Britain actually achieved continues to expand. We move now to one of the smaller but more atmospheric stone circles in the country. The Rollright stones in the Cotswolds, on the border between Oxfordshire and Warwickshire, consist of 3 separate monuments: the King's Men Stone Circle, the Kingstone Outlier, and the Whispering Knights Burial Chamber. The King's Men Circle is around 33 metres in diameter and consists of around 70 small standing stones, weathered and pitted by their 2,500 years of exposure on the open Cotswold uplands. The stones are made of a local oolitic limestone that is highly susceptible to weathering, and the heavily pocked surfaces of the surviving stones give them a striking and slightly unsettling appearance. Local legend, recorded in detail by the 17th century antiquarian William Stukeley, holds that the stones are a king and his army who were turned to stone by a witch, with the Whispering Knights being the king's traitorous knights frozen in the act of plotting against him. The Whispering Knights themselves are the remains of an earlier Neolithic burial chamber, originally a portal dolmen, of the type that is common in southwest Britain and Ireland, dating to around 3800 BC. The King's Stone, the lone outlier standing across the road from the main circle, is contemporary with the King's Men Circle and stands around 2.5 metres tall, deeply pitted by weathering and by centuries of pieces being broken off by visitors who believed that fragments of the stone had magical properties. The Rollright stones have been a focus of folk tradition, popular belief, and modern pagan practice for centuries, and they remain one of the most actively used ancient sites in Britain, with regular ceremonies held there by various contemporary religious groups. The continuity of religious use, even if the specific beliefs have changed many times over the millennia, is itself part of what makes the Rollright stones significant. We move now to consider the immediate prelude to the Roman conquest, the late Iron Age society that the Romans actually encountered when their legions landed on the British coast in 43 AD. By the early 1st century AD, Southern Britain, in particular, had developed into a complex society of tribal kingdoms, with their own coinage, their own urban centres, their own diplomatic relations with Rome, and their own internal political conflicts. The most powerful figure in late Iron Age Britain was Cunobalin, the king of the Catuvellauni tribe, who from his capital at Camulodunum, modern Colchester, ruled a kingdom that controlled much of southeastern England in the early 1st century AD. Cunobalin issued coins that show his name in Roman script alongside Celtic symbols, and his court evidently maintained substantial diplomatic and commercial relations with the Roman world across the Channel. Camulodunum itself was one of the most substantial pre-Roman urban centres in northern Europe. The site sprawled across several square kilometres, enclosed by a complex of linear earthworks and dikes that defined the territory of the late Iron Age centre. Inside the dikes lay residential areas, craft workshops, religious enclosures, and the Great Mint where Cunobalin's coins were struck. Archaeological excavations have recovered evidence of imported wine amphorae from southern France and Italy, fine tablewares from continental workshops, and a wide range of personal ornaments that show the kind of cosmopolitan elite culture that had developed in late Iron Age Britain. The notion that the Romans arrived in a primitive backwater is contradicted by every spade of soil turned over at Camulodunum. They arrived in an established complex society that had been engaging with the Mediterranean world on its own terms for generations. When Cunobalin died around 40 AD, his kingdom passed to his sons, and the political instability that followed provided the Roman Emperor Claudius with the pretext he needed to launch the invasion of Britain that had been considered and rejected by his predecessors. The invasion fleet sailed in 43 AD. The legions landed probably at Richborough on the Kent coast, and within a few years the southern lowlands of Britain were under Roman control. Camulodunum was captured early in the campaign and became the first Roman colonia in Britain, the foundation of what would eventually become the Roman provincial centre. The native Iron Age elite was incorporated into the new Roman order, or driven into rebellion, or pushed back into the territories of the still independent northern and western tribes. The Roman conquest is sometimes presented as the moment when civilization arrived in Britain. This is, as the entire arc of our journey tonight should have made clear, an absurd misrepresentation. Civilization had been present in Britain for thousands of years before the legions came. The British had been building monumental architecture for over 3,000 years. They had been engaged in long-distance trade with continental Europe and the Mediterranean for at least 2,000 years. They had developed sophisticated metalworking, complex religious institutions, organized agriculture, urban centers, regional confederations, and an artistic tradition that produced some of the finest decorative work of the ancient world. The Romans brought a different kind of civilization, an imperial one organized around law, military discipline, and bureaucratic administration. They did not bring civilization itself. They imposed their own version of it on top of a civilization that already existed, and they then largely erased the memory of what they had displaced. The Druids, in particular, were systematically eliminated by the Roman authorities, partly because of their political influence as a pan-tribal religious institution, partly because the Romans found their religious practices, including the apparent practice of human sacrifice, genuinely offensive. The Roman writer Tacitus describes the assault on the Druid stronghold on the island of Mona, modern Anglesey, in 60 or 61 AD, in which the legions of Suetonius Paulinus crossed the Menai Strait, slaughtered the assembled Druids, cut down the sacred groves, and destroyed the religious heart of pre-Roman British religion. With the Druids went whatever oral tradition they had preserved about the meaning of the great monuments, about the genealogies of the tribes, about the religious system that had built and maintained Stonehenge and Avebury and Maes Howe and Callanish. The Druids' refusal to commit their teachings to writing meant that when they were killed, their knowledge died with them. We have nothing left of their actual doctrines, only Roman descriptions of what those doctrines appeared to be from the outside. We move now to one of the most personally illuminating recent discoveries in pre-Roman British archaeology. In 1903, in a small cave called Gough's Cave, in the dramatic limestone gorge at Cheddar in Somerset, workmen extending the cave system uncovered a complete human skeleton. The skeleton was that of a young man, around 20 years old at death, who had lived around 7,150 BC in the Mesolithic period, several thousand years before the first farmers arrived in Britain. He was named Cheddar Man, and for over a century he was studied as the oldest complete human skeleton from Britain, his bones held in the Natural History Museum in London, his face the subject of various reconstructions, based on the assumption that early modern Europeans had probably resembled their later descendants. In 2018, a research team led by Selina Brace and the Natural History Museum sequenced the ancient DNA from Cheddar Man's bones, becoming the first ever successful sequencing of the genome of a complete prehistoric British individual. The results overturned more than a century of assumptions. Cheddar Man had dark to black skin, dark curly hair, and blue eyes. The genes that produce light skin in modern Europeans had not yet entered the British population. They would arrive only later, with the spread of farming and subsequent migrations, and they would not become dominant in northern European populations until the Bronze Age or even later. The Mesolithic hunters of Britain were a dark-skinned people. The reconstruction of Cheddar Man's face, based on the genetic evidence, shows a young man whose appearance would surprise most people today, an appearance that no 19th century or 20th century reconstruction had imagined. The implications of the Cheddar Man genome go beyond his individual appearance. They reveal something fundamental about the population history of Britain. The modern British population is descended only in small part from the people who lived in Britain in the Mesolithic. The Neolithic farmers who arrived around 4000 BC brought a substantially different genetic profile, and they largely replaced the existing hunter-gatherer population. Then, the Beaker people, who arrived around 2500 BC, including the immediate ancestors of the Avebury archer, brought yet another genetic profile, and they in turn largely replaced the Neolithic population. Modern British people are descended primarily from these later waves of migration, with only a small fraction of their genetic ancestry derived from the deep Mesolithic population that Cheddar Man represents. The deep prehistory of Britain is, in genetic terms, the history of repeated population replacements, of waves of migration that each profoundly transformed the human population of these islands. The cave at Cheddar that contained Cheddar Man's bones also contains evidence of darker practices. The same site has produced fragments of human bone from multiple individuals, showing clear-cut marks made by stone tools, evidence of the systematic defleshing of corpses. Some of the skulls had been carefully shaped into cups, with the facial bones removed and the brain cavities cleaned out, leaving the cranial vault as a usable vessel. The skull cups of Gough's Cave are among the oldest evidence of cannibalism in post-glacial Britain, and they raise unsettling questions about what kind of cultural practices were being carried out at the cave in the centuries around Cheddar Man's lifetime. Was it funerary cannibalism, a way of honoring the dead by incorporating their bodies into the living community? Was it ritual cannibalism connected to warfare or religion? Was it nutritional cannibalism in times of scarcity? The evidence allows for various interpretations, but the practice itself was clearly a significant part of Mesolithic life at this location, persisting across at least several generations. We move now to the wetlands of the Somerset Levels once again, where, in addition to the Sweet Track, an extraordinary group of late prehistoric lake villages was discovered and excavated in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The lake villages of Glastonbury and Mere were settlements built on artificial platforms in the marshes around the Somerset Hills, dating to the Iron Age between roughly 250 BC and 50 AD. Glastonbury Lake Village, excavated by Arthur Bullide and Harold St. George Grey between 1892 and 1907, was one of the most spectacularly preserved Iron Age settlements in Britain. The village consisted of around 90 roundhouses built on a foundation of timber, brushwood and clay laid down in the marsh. The whole settlement, surrounded by a timber palisade and accessed by causeways from the surrounding higher ground. The waterlogged conditions in the Glastonbury Lake Village preserved an extraordinary range of organic material that would have been lost on a dry land site. Wooden bowls and trays, carved wooden tubs, leather offcuts, woven basketry, textiles, gaming pieces, musical instruments, and even traces of food, including bread and cheese, were all recovered from the excavations. The Iron Age inhabitants of Glastonbury were craft workers as well as farmers, producing pottery, metalwork, leather goods, and textiles for trade. They had connections that extended across continental Europe, with imported goods, including Mediterranean wine amphorae and continental coins found among the village debris. They had a literate or semi-literate culture, judging by inscribed objects, although the script used has never been fully understood. They lived in what was, by any reasonable definition, a sophisticated, late Iron Age community, on the eve of the Roman conquest. The lake villages of Glastonbury and Mere were not isolated phenomena. Similar settlements have been identified at other locations across the British wetlands, and they represent a particular adaptation to the rich resources of the marshes and meres of late prehistoric Britain. The decision to build a village in the middle of a marsh, on a platform painstakingly constructed of timber and clay, reflects the same impulse that led the Bronze Age inhabitants of Flag Fen to build their causeway, that led the Iron Age communities of Scotland to build their crannogs, that led the Bronze Age people of Norfolk to construct Stonehenge in the salt marsh. The wetlands of pre-Roman Britain were not marginal zones avoided by human settlement. They were positively chosen, again and again, as places to build and to live, because they offered rich resources, defensive advantages, and religious associations that made them attractive in ways that we, today, having drained most of our marshes and despised the rest, find difficult to fully appreciate. We have travelled tonight from the Mesolithic hunters of Starkar to the Iron Age villagers of Glastonbury, across nearly 10,000 years of human history on the islands that we now call Britain. We have visited stone circles on the Atlantic edge of Europe, chambered tombs whose alignments precisely capture the dying light of the winter solstice, vast Neolithic settlements that were the construction camps for monuments still standing 5,000 years later, lake villages whose timber houses still preserved the bread on their tables when they were excavated, and the burial of a young child, marking the dedication of a great timber circle that has now vanished beneath the chalk. We have looked at the bones of an immigrant who walked from the Alps to Salisbury Plain in the centuries when Stonehenge was being raised. We have looked at the preserved face of a man whose last meal was eaten in a bog 4,000 years ago. We have looked at the gold torques and the bronze swords and the carved spirals that were the public art of a society without writing, a society whose deepest religious beliefs we can only guess at, a society whose accomplishments stand in stark contradiction to the dismissive image that the Romans bequeathed to all subsequent European thought about the pre-Roman peoples of these islands. What does it add up to? What is the picture of pre-Roman Britain that emerges from all of this evidence, taken together, considered honestly, set against the older textbook accounts that we were all taught in school? The picture is this. The British Isles were inhabited continuously, with substantial sophistication, for the entirety of the post-glacial period. The people who lived here built monuments that rival any in ancient Europe. They engaged in long-distance trade across the continent and into the Mediterranean. They developed regional cultures of remarkable artistic and technical accomplishment. They organized themselves into complex societies with hierarchical structures, religious institutions, and political confederations. They responded to environmental change, to migrations of new peoples, to internal social pressures, with creativity and adaptability. They produced, over thousands of years, a rich and continuous tradition of human culture on these islands, a tradition that the Roman invasion interrupted but did not begin, and a tradition whose full sophistication we are still in the process of recovering through the patient work of modern archaeology. The mysteries remain. We do not know why Stonehenge was built. We do not know what Silbury Hill was for. We do not know what the cup and ring marks mean. We do not know what religious beliefs animated the great timber circles, what cosmological understanding lay behind the precise solar and lunar alignments, what the rituals at the Ness of Brodgar actually consisted of, what the bog bodies represented to the communities who placed them in the water. We have evidence. We have hypotheses. We have, in many cases, careful reconstructions of plausible interpretations based on the convergence of multiple lines of evidence. What we do not have is certainty. The pre-Roman builders of Britain left no texts. They left only their constructions. The constructions speak, but they speak in a language whose grammar we have only partially learned. This is, in some ways, the appropriate state of affairs. The deep past should be mysterious. It should resist easy assimilation into our contemporary frameworks of meaning. The fact that we cannot fully explain why the people of Salisbury Plain spent generations dragging stones across hundreds of kilometers to build a structure they would never see completed in any single human lifetime is, in itself, a form of testimony to how different their world was from ours, how different their values were, how different their conception of what mattered and what was worth doing. We try to understand them through our own categories, our own ideas about religion and politics and economics, and we partially succeed, but the gaps and the failures of understanding are themselves significant. They tell us that we are in the presence of a genuinely other kind of human existence, neither primitive nor proto-modern, but something distinct, something whose full shape we may never recover. The Romans, when they arrived, gave us the first written accounts of the people of Britain. Caesar wrote about them in his commentaries on the Gallic War. Tacitus wrote about them in his Agricola and his Annals. Strabo and Diodorus Siculus added their geographical and ethnographic descriptions. These Roman texts are valuable. They are also profoundly partial, biased toward the perspective of the conqueror, dismissive of much of what they encountered, and concerned primarily with the political and military realities that mattered to the Roman state. They tell us next to nothing about the religion, the art, the daily life, or the deeper history of the British peoples. For that, we have to look at the archaeological evidence, and the archaeological evidence has been telling us, increasingly clearly over the past 50 years, that the pre-Roman British were a far more sophisticated people than the Roman accounts allow. The work of recovering this lost civilization is still ongoing. New sites are being identified every year, through aerial photography, through geophysical survey, through fortuitous discoveries during construction work, through the patient, slow excavation of sites that have been known for decades, but whose full significance has only recently become apparent. Climate change, by exposing peat bogs and eroding coastlines, is bringing some sites to light, even as it threatens others with destruction. The ancient DNA revolution is transforming our understanding of the population history of these islands. New dating techniques are providing more precise chronologies than were ever possible before. The picture continues to develop, to deepen, to refine. The pre-Roman Britain of our textbooks 10 years from now will not be quite the same as the pre-Roman Britain of our textbooks today, and that change will reflect, above all, the ongoing patient work of archaeologists and the steadily accumulating weight of new evidence. What remains constant across all the revisions and refinements is the basic recognition that something extraordinary happened on these islands in the thousands of years before the Roman invasion. People came here, found these green and rainy lands at the western edge of Europe, and made them into a home. They built monuments that have lasted longer than any subsequent political arrangement on these islands has lasted. They created art that still moves us when we look at it. They developed religious traditions whose echoes can still be felt in the landscape today, in the alignments of stones and the orientations of chambers and the persistence of sacred sites that have been continuously revered across multiple religious eras. They left, in short, a civilization. The Romans tried to dismiss it. The Saxons tried to forget it. The medieval Christian writers tried to baptize it into something they could understand. The Victorian antiquarians tried to romanticize it. The modern academic archaeologists have tried, more carefully and more patiently than any of their predecessors, to actually understand it on its own terms. The work is not complete. The work may never be complete, but the recognition that the work matters, that the pre-Roman peoples of Britain deserve to be taken seriously as a civilization rather than as a primitive prelude to Roman civilization, has become, finally, the consensus of serious modern scholarship. When you next walk past a stone circle, or look up at the chalk lines of the Uffington Horse, or pass one of the green mounds that dot the British countryside, take a moment to consider what you are looking at. You are looking at the work of human beings who, in many cases, knew exactly what they were doing. They had reasons, they had skills, they had a worldview within which their actions made sense. They were the equals of any human community that has lived since, in their capacities and their accomplishments, even if their values and their goals were profoundly different from our own. They were the people who built things we still can't explain, not because they were incompetent or primitive, but because they were the inheritors of traditions and worldviews that we no longer have access to. The buildings remain. The builders are gone. The buildings, in their silent, monumental persistence, are still trying to tell us something. the work of listening continues. The story of pre-Roman Britain is not a story of barbarism waiting for civilization. It is a story of civilizations succeeding one another, each transforming the landscape and the population in its own way, building on what came before, contributing to what would come after. The Mesolithic hunters left behind the lakeshore platforms and the antler headdresses of Star Car. The early Neolithic farmers built the sweet track and the first chambered tombs. The late Neolithic communities raised the great stone circles, including Stonehenge and Avebury, and the extraordinary architectural achievements of Orkney. The Bronze Age peoples built the metalworking traditions and the lake villages and the great hill figures. The Iron Age tribes built the hill forts, the brocks, the proto-urban centres like Camulodunum, and produced the gold torques and the bronze shields that are among the finest objects of any ancient European culture. Each phase built on what came before. Each phase added something new. Each phase contributed to the long accumulating presence of human civilization on these islands. The Roman conquest interrupted this long story and imposed a different framework on top of it, but the underlying story continued, and many of the place names, the territorial boundaries, the religious sites, and the cultural traditions that the Romans encountered continued to operate beneath their imperial overlay, surviving into the post-Roman period and shaping the medieval Britain that would eventually emerge from the wreckage of the Western Empire. That is the story we have been telling tonight, in fragments and episodes across the great arc of monuments and burials and artifacts that pre-Roman Britain has left behind. It is a story of human achievement on a scale that the older textbooks rarely acknowledged. It is a story of mystery, because so much of what these people did still resists our explanations. It is a story of continuity, because the landscape they shaped is still the landscape we live in. The monuments they built are still standing. The bones of the dead they buried are still in the chalk. The carved spirals and cup and ring marks are still on the stones of the upland moors. They have not gone away. They are still here. The civilization that built things we still can't explain. The civilization that came before Rome. The civilization that has been quietly underwriting the deep history of the British Isles for 10,000 years is still present beneath the surface of every map and every road and every cultivated field. We have only to look and to keep looking and to be willing to acknowledge what is actually there. Thank you for listening. The work of understanding the pre-Roman past of Britain is the work of generations, and it continues. The discoveries that will be made in the coming decades will, almost certainly, continue to deepen and complicate the picture that we have today. New sites will be found, new techniques will be developed, new interpretations will emerge. And through it all, the standing stones will continue to stand, the chambered tombs will continue to hold their place in the earth, the chalk horses will continue to be cut clean every few years by the descendants of those who first cut them 3,000 years ago. The civilization that built them is gone. The civilizations that have come and gone since they were built are also gone, most of them. The buildings remain, the questions remain. And the patient work of trying to answer the questions, while accepting that some of them may never be answered, is one of the long, quiet privileges of being interested in the deep past of these islands. We are not done with this story. We may never be done with this story. The story continues to unfold, slowly, in the patient hands of those who are willing to keep listening to what the stones have to say.